For most of recorded history, rosemary had nothing to do with food. It was medicine. The cooking came later. The rosemary in your kitchen right now, the one you put on chicken or vegetables, that same plant spent thousands of years in a very different place. Not the kitchen, the sick room, the temple, the healer's table. Ancient healers used it for memory loss, poor blood flow, grief, infection, and organ problems. They burned it in hospitals to clean the air. They put it in burial cloths and wedding crowns for the same reason, and then at some point we moved it to the spice rack and forgot everything else. This is the full story of rosemary, where it came from, what ancient healers actually used it for, why people all over the world who never met each other all found the same plant and used it the same way, and what modern science has now confirmed about everything they knew. By the end of this, you will never look at that little jar the same way again. The first thing you need to know about rosemary is that we have it backwards. Today, we think of it as a cooking herb that maybe has some health benefits on the side. A nice smell, good with lamb, something you might find in a shampoo. But that is a modern idea. And it is not how the world saw rosemary for most of history. The plant's full name is Rosmarinus officinalis. That second word, officinalis, is important. In old plant naming, Officinalis means it came from the officina. The officina was the room in a monastery where medicines were stored and given out. When a plant has Officinalis in its name, it means it was officially recognized as a medicine, not a flavoring. A medicine. Other plants you know carry that same name. Lavender officinalis, Salvia officinalis, which is sage, Melissa officinalis, which is lemon balm. These are not cooking herbs that happen to have some health benefits. They are healing plants that later found their way into cooking. That difference matters, because it changes how you understand everything that comes next. Every ancient culture that found rosemary did not reach for it to make food taste better. They reached for it because someone was sick. And that is where the real story starts. The oldest records of rosemary being used as medicine come from ancient Egypt. Rosemary grows naturally around the Mediterranean. It likes dry, rocky ground near the coast. You find it growing wild from Spain all the way to Syria. The ancient Egyptians traded across the Mediterranean and got hold of rosemary early. They valued it enough to put it in tombs. Dried rosemary has been found inside Egyptian burial sites going back to around 3000 BC. This was not decoration. In ancient Egypt, the plants placed with the dead were chosen on purpose, either because they helped preserve the body or because they had spiritual meaning, or both. Rosemary was chosen for both. The Egyptians had noticed something we now understand through science. Rosemary contains strong compounds that fight bacteria and slow decay. For a culture that had turned the art of preservation into a science, a plant that naturally slowed rotting was not just useful, it was sacred. Egyptian healers, called SWW, wrote their knowledge down on papyrus scrolls that have survived thousands of years. Rosemary shows up in preparations connected to the head and the breathing system. These are the same two areas that healers all over the ancient world kept coming back to when they used this plant. But it is when we move into the Greek and Roman world that the records become very clear and very detailed. The ancient Greeks called rosemary libanotis. That word was connected to things that were fragrant and resinous, the same category as frankincense. That tells you something right away. The Greeks were not thinking of rosemary as food. They were putting it in the same group as sacred resins used in temple healing. Hippocrates, who is often called the father of medicine, wrote about warming and stimulating plants in the 4th and 5th centuries BC. The healers who followed his tradition saw rosemary as a warming herb, something that woke up slow systems, moved stuck blood, and got the body going. They prescribed it for liver and stomach problems, noticing through years of observation that it seemed to help the body clean itself out. But the most important record of rosemary in the ancient world comes from a man named Dioscorides. He was a doctor who traveled with the Roman army in the 1st century AD. He went all over the known world, watched how plants were used everywhere he went, and wrote it all down in a book called De Materia Medica. That title just means On Medical Materials. This book became the main reference for herbal medicine in the Western world for over 1,500 years. In that book, Dioscorides writes about rosemary clearly. He records it as a warming herb. He documents its use for jaundice, for problems of the head and brain, and for conditions involving the heart and blood flow. He was not writing down old stories. He was documenting what he had seen with his own eyes across decades of medical practice in many different countries. The Romans then took all of that Greek knowledge and kept building on it. Pliny the Elder wrote about rosemary in his Natural History in the 1st century AD. He described it growing wild all over Italy and noted how it was used in medicine, in religious practice, and in everyday life. Roman doctors prescribed rosemary tea for stomach problems, headaches, tiredness, and memory, and mental sharpness. That last one is worth stopping at. The connection between rosemary and memory is not a modern wellness claim. It is one of the oldest and most consistently recorded observations in the entire history of herbal medicine. Greek students wore rosemary garlands while studying. Roman speakers used rosemary before giving speeches. This was not superstition. These were people who had watched, over many generations, what happened when people used this plant regularly. And sharper memory was one of the most consistent things they reported. We will come back to why that is when we get to the science, but hold that thought. Because the Romans also noticed something about rosemary that almost nobody talks about today. Roman doctors noticed that rosemary seemed to protect people during outbreaks of illness. During plagues and epidemics, burning rosemary in sick rooms and public spaces was standard practice. What passed for hospitals in the ancient world burned rosemary all the time. This was not just ritual, it was infection control. And it was done consistently across the Roman Empire for hundreds of years. When you understand that rosemary contains compounds called camphor, cineol, and rosmarinic acid, all of which have been shown to fight bacteria and viruses, the Roman practice stops looking like superstition and starts looking like medicine without a microscope. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD, something important happened to herbal knowledge. It did not disappear. It moved inside monastery walls. The Christian monastic tradition, especially the Benedictine monks, became the keepers of ancient medical knowledge through the early medieval period. Monks copied ancient texts, including Dioscorides. They kept large medicinal gardens called physic gardens. They were the main source of health care for the communities around them. The monastery was a library, a pharmacy, and a hospital all at once, and rosemary was at the center of all of it. One of the most important documents from this period is a manuscript called the Capitulare de Villis. It was issued by the Emperor Charlemagne around 795 AD. It was basically a royal order listing every plant that had to be grown in the imperial gardens across his empire. Rosemary is on that list, not as a cooking herb, as a medicinal plant to be grown, maintained, and made available for healing. But the single most important person in the medieval herbal story is a 12th century abbess named Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard ran a monastery in what is now Germany. She was one of the most educated people of her time, and she wrote down her medical knowledge in a work called Physica. It was a careful, detailed record of the healing properties of plants, animals, and minerals. She believed God had built healing into creation on purpose, and she documented what she saw with both precision and conviction. In Physica, Hildegard writes about rosemary in specific terms. She prescribes it for conditions of the head, the heart, and what she calls a cold or slow constitution. She documents its use for low mood, for what she calls heaviness of spirit, and for physical tiredness. She recommends it both taken as a drink and used on the body as a wash or compress. What is striking is how closely her descriptions match both the ancient Greek and Roman records before her, and the modern research that would come nearly 1,000 years after her. She had no knowledge of biochemistry or brain science, but she had centuries of careful, built-up observation behind her, and her conclusions were right. The monasteries also developed one of the most famous herbal preparations in history, a formula from a 14th century manuscript called the Queen of Hungary Water. It was based mainly on rosemary and was used for joint pain, for stiffness, and for conditions affecting the muscles. Whether the story behind the name is literally true or not, the formula was used across Europe for centuries and eventually became one of the earliest recorded alcohol-based herbal extracts. The monks were not primitive healers. They were running the most advanced healthcare available in medieval Europe. And their most consistently recommended herb, the one that appears in almost every monastic medical record across many countries and many centuries, was rosemary. Here is the part that should really make you stop and think. Greece, Egypt, Rome, medieval Europe, ancient India, and ancient China all came to the same conclusions about rosemary, on their own, without sharing notes. In many cases without even knowing the others existed. And yet, the overlap in what they recorded is remarkable. Every single one of these traditions documented rosemary as good for the head and the brain. Every single one documented its use for blood flow and slow or cold conditions in the body. Every single one documented its ability to fight infection or purify the air, even if they described it differently. And every single one documented some version of its effect on mood, energy, and mental sharpness. In Ayurvedic medicine from ancient India, rosemary was classified as a herb that lights up the digestive fire and supports the brain and nervous system. Indian healers prescribed it for mental fog, weak memory, and nerve weakness. Different language, same plant knowledge. In traditional Chinese medicine, rosemary was used to warm the digestive center, move stuck energy in the body, and address headaches and cold conditions. Again, different system, same observations. This kind of agreement across cultures that had no contact with each other does not happen by chance. When healers on opposite sides of the world, working in completely different medical traditions, all arrive at the same plant for the same problems, that is not folklore. That is a real signal. And when modern science finally studied rosemary in the 20th and 21st centuries, what it found confirmed what every one of those traditions had been recording for thousands of years. If this is showing you something about rosemary you have never seen before, take a second right now and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment, even just one word. That is genuinely how more people find this content, and it means more than you know. Thank you for being here. Now let us get into the science. Modern researchers were not trying to prove ancient healers right. They were just trying to understand what is inside plants. But with rosemary, the ancient record kept turning out to be correct. Rosemary contains several active compounds. The main ones researchers have studied are rosmarinic acid, carnosic acid, carnosol, camphor, borneol, and 1,8-cineol, which is also called eucalyptol. Each of these has been studied in published research. Together they explain almost everything the ancient world observed. Start with memory. The Greek students who wore rosemary garlands while studying were not doing something pointless. A 2012 study published in Therapeutic Advances in Psychopharmacology found that simply being in a room where rosemary essential oil had been diffused improved both the speed and accuracy of memory tasks. The compound responsible is mainly 1,8-cineol. It crosses into the brain and blocks an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. That enzyme breaks down a brain chemical called acetylcholine which plays a big role in memory and learning. By slowing that breakdown, rosemary effectively increases the amount of acetylcholine available in the brain. This is the same basic process targeted by several pharmaceutical drugs used for Alzheimer's disease. The ancient Greeks did not know about acetylcholine, but they watched what happened to people who used rosemary regularly and wrote it down accurately for 2,500 years. Now look at blood flow. The Roman observation that rosemary warmed the body and moved blood is backed by research showing that rosemary compounds, especially camphor and borneol, help widen blood vessels and improve circulation. Applied to the skin, rosemary preparations noticeably increase blood flow in that area. Taken internally, the compounds support heart and circulatory function. The warming effect the ancients described was real. It was circulatory. Now, look at fighting infection. The Roman practice of burning rosemary in sick rooms has been confirmed by multiple studies showing that rosemary essential oil kills a wide range of harmful bacteria. A 2007 study in the Journal of Food Protection documented this clearly. Carnosic acid and rosmarinic acid have both shown antiviral and antifungal properties in lab studies. When Roman doctors burned rosemary in plague wards, they were doing a basic but real form of air cleaning. Now, look at inflammation. Rosmarinic acid is one of the strongest natural anti-inflammatory compounds found in plant research. It blocks several inflammation pathways at once, including the same pathway targeted by ibuprofen. Hildegard of Bingen prescribed rosemary for pain and joint stiffness. Medieval healers used it for conditions we would now call inflammatory arthritis. The mechanism they had no name for was rosmarinic acid, working as a natural pain and inflammation blocker. Now look at the liver. Hippocrates prescribed rosemary for liver and spleen conditions. Modern research has shown that carnosic acid and carnosol protect liver cells from damage. Studies show rosemary extracts reduce signs of liver stress in animal tests. The ancient observation was pointing in the right direction. And then there is the antioxidant research. Carnosic acid is one of the most powerful antioxidants ever found in a plant. A 2010 study estimated that it makes up most of rosemary's antioxidant activity and suggested it may protect brain cells in conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Ancient healers prescribed rosemary for aging, mental decline, and the slow breakdown of the body. Modern antioxidant research tells us exactly why those observations were not accidental. The ancient world did not have the language of biochemistry, but they had something we increasingly undervalue. Hundreds of years of careful observation passed down through generations across many cultures. And in the case of rosemary, that observation was consistently and strikingly accurate. Knowing that rosemary works is one thing. Knowing how ancient healers actually used it is another. The methods they developed over thousands of years were much more thoughtful than shaking dried rosemary out of a jar. Ancient healers worked with rosemary in 4 main ways. The first was the decoction. This is the simplest and oldest preparation. Fresh or dried rosemary was placed in cold water, brought to a boil, and simmered for 20 to 40 minutes before being strained and drunk. Roman and Greek healers prescribed rosemary decoctions for stomach problems, liver conditions, and headaches. Boiling the herb in water pulls out the water-based compounds, mainly rosmarinic acid, into the liquid. What you end up with is a strong medicinal tea. Ancient texts say it should be made with fresh water and drunk warm. That was consistent with the understanding of rosemary as a warming herb. The second was infused oil. Rosemary sprigs were placed in olive oil and left in warm sunlight for several weeks, or gently heated together over low heat until the oil took on the plant's compounds. This oil was used on the body for joint pain, muscle aches, headaches applied to the temples, and for the scalp and hair. Both Egyptian and Roman records document rosemary-infused oil for scalp treatment. This is worth noting because a 2015 study in SkinMed Journal found rosemary oil comparable to minoxidil, the active ingredient in Rogaine, for promoting hair growth. The ancients were treating hair loss with rosemary oil thousands of years before that study existed. The third was inhalation. This is the preparation most often dismissed as ritual. But it was deliberate medicine. Rosemary was burned in sick rooms and healing temples. Fresh rosemary bundles were crushed and held near the face so the active compounds, mainly 1,8-cineol and camphor, could be breathed in directly. Greek healers documented this for breathing problems. Medieval healers used it during epidemics. From a modern pharmacology standpoint, inhalation is actually one of the fastest and most efficient ways to get compounds to the brain and respiratory system. The ancients had worked that out without modern science. The fourth was the poultice and compress. Fresh rosemary was crushed to release its oils, wrapped in cloth, and placed directly on painful or swollen areas of the body. This was used for joint pain, muscle injuries, and what medieval healers called cold swellings. Applying crushed fresh rosemary directly to the skin delivers camphor and borneol, which improve local blood flow and reduce pain. Modern topical pain products still use these same compounds for the same reasons. One thing consistent across all ancient preparation methods is the emphasis on quality and freshness. Ancient healers were specific about this. The best rosemary came from plants growing in sunny coastal conditions, harvested before full flowering, and used as fresh as possible. This was not personal preference. The active oil content in rosemary is significantly higher in fresh plant material harvested at the right time. Ancient healers had observed the difference between fresh and degraded material and built that knowledge into how they prescribed it. The rosemary in your kitchen has been dried, packaged, stored, and shipped. It is not worthless, but it is a reduced version of what ancient healers were actually working with. The closest thing to what they used is fresh rosemary from a plant you grow yourself, infused into a carrier oil, or made into a strong tea from fresh material. That is what they were prescribing. And that is what most of the research has studied. So what do we do with all of this? Rosemary is not a miracle cure. Ancient healers did not treat it as one either. They understood it as a powerful, well-documented plant with a specific range of effects on specific conditions. They used it carefully, consistently, and over long periods of time. And what they recorded has now been confirmed by some of the most advanced tools in modern medical research. Here are the 3 things that stay with me most from this story. The first is this. Moving rosemary from medicine to cooking was not something that just happened. It was a slow choice made over many centuries as pharmaceutical medicine grew in authority and herbal knowledge was pushed to the side. That choice had a cost. Not because modern medicine does not work, but because the two are not opposites. And treating them like they are has left us with a very shallow understanding of the plants we have lived alongside for thousands of years. The second is the agreement. When you realize that Greek doctors, Egyptian priests, Roman army surgeons, Indian Ayurvedic healers, Chinese physicians, and medieval Christian monks all independently reached the same conclusions about the same plant, you are not looking at coincidence. You are looking at something real that serious, careful people kept rediscovering because the evidence kept showing up in front of them. That kind of agreement deserves respect. And the third is the simplest. This plant is available right now, today. You do not need a prescription. You do not need a specialist. You do not need an expensive supplement. You need a pot of soil, a sunny windowsill, and the knowledge of what you are actually growing. Ancient healers did not have pharmacies. They had gardens, and they knew exactly what to do with what grew in them. Rosemary has been sitting in plain sight for thousands of years. It spent most of that time in the medicine room. We are the ones who moved it to the spice rack. And knowing that, you can decide where it belongs in your life. If this opened something up for you, The best thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. That is genuinely how more people find this content. Please keep us in your prayers. God bless you.